Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Ilona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
Hi, Oliver. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to meet with you because I've found some of your books really helpful to me and actually a complete reprieve from feeling like you have to be productive and busy and efficient all the time. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I mean, I'm basically issuing that advice to myself. That's the lifelong struggle.
Yeah, totally. I think for all of us, reading some of your thinking, there's some hard relating that goes on. Your book, your latest one, and kind of your thinking in general, sort of challenges our conceptions of productivity and the value of it. And one of the messages seems to be, you think you're constantly trying to sort your life out, complete your to-do list, tick off everything, transform yourself into a better version of who you are. And you kind of say, well, sorry, it's not going to happen. To some of us, the gut reaction to that might be a little bit devastating, but for you, it's quite freeing. Can you tell us why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's devastating and freeing. And so I'm constantly at pains in public talks and things to reassure people that after the incredibly depressing bit, there's going to be a really empowering bit so they don't all leave before that point. I think that, what we're talking about here, when we're talking about trying to get to the point where we've sorted our lives out, or we're on top of everything, or we're sort of not making anybody mad with us, or producing perfect work, or feeling confident about the future, all these very different forms of the same thing are all, they're things that we don't actually get to do as humans. So they're ultimately attempts to sort of transcend the unpleasant claustrophobicness of being finite human, in which there's just always will be too much to do, and you really will never know what the future holds and all the rest of it. So if you can sort of go through that defeat and see that you've been trying to do something not really difficult, which is how it feels for us day to day, but actually systematically impossible, I think the reason that's liberating is because you get to sort of set down that burden, and then it's much easier to let yourself do the important things and the interesting things and the meaningful things that make a difference. If you're always postponing implicitly, the real meaning of life, the really important part is going to come when I've sorted all this out, in all sorts of subtle ways, it actually leads to you holding off from doing the stuff that is the substance of a meaningful life or that makes a difference to the rest of the world. So it really is, I insist that it is a motivational and empowering message. But yeah, you do have to go through this kind of surrender to get there.
You point to a quote in your book from another German sociologist saying that kind of the condition of modern life is that we're striving all the time to make everything controllable. That's our big aim. How does this manifest, and why do you think we're so desperate to control everything?
This is the work of Hartmut Rosa, who wrote a big and fascinating book called Resonance. The subtitle is A Sociology of Our Relationship to the World. And he's primarily looking at the way that societally and civilizationally you can sort of understand the whole project in some sense as increasing the territory of that which we exert control over. But I, in the way that I do, sort of commandeered this for how to think about your morning routine and your daily schedule and your to-do list as well. And I think it's really obvious, and to be fair, he says this, right? It's really obvious that happens on a day-to-day level. We sort of implicitly feel that life would be better if we had a bit more control over things. We felt a bit more in the driver's seat. We knew what was going on and could dictate how the day unfolded a bit more successfully. Doing this kind of squeezes out of life the very thing that makes it worth living, the thing he calls resonance. If you don't succeed in getting control of your life and you're struggling to do so, it's very unpleasant and agonizing. But if you do succeed, if you succeed too much, it sort of leaves everything sort of cold and dead. And that a lot of what we really value in life, whether we realize it or not, comes from having a certain amount of influence, but then actually not knowing how the world will respond. The obvious examples are things like, if you sit down to watch a football match and you already knew the outcome, there would be nothing. There'd be no life in that experience. If you're setting out to research something for a PhD thesis, but you actually fully understand the entire field at the start of it, what's the point?
How did you come to kind of have these ideas about control and why they were so significant? Is it from experience in your own life? Is it through kind of like doing academic research? How did you come to write this book and have this idea, oh my God, I'm going to let go of control over my life?
I mean, yeah, all the stuff that I write, and I think this is probably true, whether it's admitted or not, of every book in the sort of advice, self-help, personal development kind of genre, is me working through my own screw-ups and being constantly amazed that there are lots and lots of us who are similarly screwed up, basically. And I think there's a lot of value, even before you get to solutions and things to do about it. People seem to find a lot of value just in having that articulated. You know, I think it's freeing in a certain way just to know that we're all in, or lots of us anyway, the slightly neurotic and anxious ones, are all in the same boat. The thing about control specifically, I mean, where this book, Meditations for Mortals, sort of what that came out of was this dawning realization that I sort of understood on some intellectual level plenty about how I wanted to show up for life and what I wanted to do differently and how I wanted to be a parent and be a writer and all the rest of it, and could sort of still just completely fail to actually do that for months and years on end. So I wanted to explore this idea of actually, the word actually appears quite a few times, sort of actually doing the things that we know would make our lives meaningful, and what gets in the way of that. And basically, I think what gets in the way of that is trying to exert too much control over the process, to put it briefly.
Historically, you've kind of been a bit of a skeptic of self-help books. I don't know if that's a fair thing for me to say, but with the antidote, you kind of pick apart quite a lot of traditional self-help approaches. And I was quite surprised in this book that it really is very much structured like other self-help books I've read. It's tips, it's going through a series of different days and weeks and how you should approach your life. It's really, really direct self-help. And yeah, I was quite surprised to see that you'd written a book like that. Why is your book different to other self-help books that are telling people how to live?
Great question. I think it is, in one sense, in that tradition, and then obviously I believe that in another sense it's like completely different. It's structured as 4 weeks of short chapters, 1 per day. Obviously, talk about control. I certainly can't control how people actually read it, but that's the sort of suggestion, that you might do 1 a day. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And that is a very sort of course-like structure. That's a very sort of standard self-help, like do this for this amount of time and these things will change. I think, or I flatter myself, that what I'm actually ending up doing on most of those days is sort of trying to pull the rug from under the idea that what you need is a big personality transformation, or you need to sort of internalize my exciting new system that then in 6 months' time, when you finally get a free moment, you can put into practice in this kind of wonderfully life-changing way. And really, instead, this is part of the daily structure idea, try to do things that will just very subtly change how you live through that day, right in the middle of your life. So things that I'm suggesting might affect how you make a decision, or how you sort of order the activities in your day. Or you might like violently disagree with them and do things differently for that reason, which I think is also fine. So it's actually an effort to sort of make the change happen, or allow openness to change in the midst of all that. And I think the big problem with a lot of conventional self-help is that it sort of creates this temptation to say, like, okay, it's great stuff. I'm going to take notes. I'm going to memorize it all and then make a huge plan. And then it's a few months later and you've got bored of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the kind of stationary industry around that whole way of thinking, you're going to, literally get a planner, like write down all these long lists. And I feel like maybe a few of us on this call are susceptible to stationary's approach there.
Yeah, totally. No, and me too.
One of the things that I thought about when I started reading, and I haven't finished the book, so I'm going to try and take it at pace, the recommended pace. So one of the things that struck me was that a lot of this really spoke to me, but I wondered if it's as applicable everybody. So I'd love to hear how much you think one book can help people who are in kind of a diversity of circumstances. There's one chapter, for example, about accepting that the sort of trade-offs, and every decision you make, there will be, maybe someone's a bit annoyed with you, but you just have to roll with it. Or, maybe you say, I'm not going to send this email because it's not crucial, but your boss is like, thinks it's not 100% ideal. There's like a range of circumstances there. For some people, the barriers to changing their behavior and just doing something and accepting the consequences are much higher, or the stakes are higher. I'd love to hear you talk a bit about whether this book is for everybody, if it can equally be for someone in a kind of more vulnerable economic or personal position as well.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating topic, and it's one that I sort of directly taught, because there's a way of doing this kind of self-help where you just sort of, insist that everybody's personal situation is entirely a product of their own thinking. And if they're economically vulnerable, they just need to think more abundantly. And that's clearly nonsense. So, if you're going to be in this field and not say that, you need to grapple with these issues. I mean, I've got sort of several responses. And one, just quickly, I suppose, is to defend the idea of writing books for some people that are not applicable to everybody, right? I think there's, on some level in my newsletter as well, I am sort of speaking to people who are knowledge workers, people who have a certain amount of control over how their day unfolds, and people who are sort of anxious rather than incredibly laid back, right? So there's personality distinctions as well. And I don't think there's anything super wrong with that. Almost a bit grandiose to think that you were writing a book that would, if only 2 million of the Britain's 66 million population buy my book, I'll be very happy. I'm kidding. That would be obviously insane sales fees, but you know what I mean? It's like, I think that's okay. But there is a really important point there. Now, I think sometimes the point is used by progressively minded people as a little bit of an excuse to themselves. It's that sort of, this isn't for everybody, so maybe it's not good advice. And that always reminds me a little bit of, commitment phobic people, usually commitment phobic men, saying that they refuse to get married until people of every sexual orientation can get married in their country or something. And that's the right attitude to have to gay marriage, just as this is the right attitude to have to differences of economic security. But the motivation for it might be something more personal and questionable in that case, just being a commitment phobe. So in the same way, I think it's important not to sort of let those ideas get in the way of making the change for yourself. But yes, okay, to answer the question directly, there are certain truths here about the idea that there are always trade-offs to be made, and that sometimes you might decide to ignore some emails or to leave a house messy or something, that are much easier for some people to take than for others. And so there's a certain quality of this whereby, it's easy for me to say is a legitimate response to that, because there are people who get fired if they don't respond to every email. There are people who could be sort of, abused if they don't keep their house incredibly tidy or something. The difficult truth there, where you have to sort of channel Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism a bit, is to say that it is still true, even though it's easy for me to say, right? It is still true that in every moment there is a kind of choice that you have. Now, it might be that those choices are such that choosing one of the options would be absolutely insane. So you don't have that kind of a choice, but you are still in the situation as a human being always that you could, in principle, take an option that would lead to your kids not having any food or to you being made homeless. Now, you don't take it, and it would be crazy to take it, but the recognition that that's sort of technically a correct description of the situation does give you a measure of agency that you didn't have before, because it connects the choice that you do make to a value that is meaningful for you, right? So if you're in a terrible job that you don't have any other option but to do, but the reason that you stay with that is because feeding your family is a thing that imbues your life with meaning, I think that's a really important thing to see, and that it is universally applicable. Now, if someone comes along and then uses it as an excuse for the fact that we have not made changes to our society so that people don't have to work in jobs like that, that's a different matter. But I think on the individual level, that choice is always there.
Yeah. I think that thought about taking actions that imbue your life with meaning is, I mean, it's such like it's such a like kind of valuable thought, but also made me think about the role of activism in society, which is partly really about following your values, trying to transform the world in a way that so that it reflects and fulfills your values, but it's also about trying to enact change. How do you reconcile the idea that you can't kind of control or change everything, and that's part of what creates a fulfilled life, with the clearly necessary place of activism, maybe climate activism, you have to think about now and in society, to kind of bring about greater justice, push forward climate agenda? How does someone operate in the activism space while being fulfilled according to kind of your thinking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that I don't sort of lean too much into the word acceptance in this book, but a lot of it is on some level about accepting reality. And I think there's a sort of standard distinction that people rightly make there between the idea of accepting that things are as they are versus accepting that they must always be that way and not be changed. So the kind of resistance to reality that I'm always tracking through this book is actually this extraordinarily powerful tendency we have to find ways to not have to feel that things are as they are. It's that sort of non-acceptance that sort of builds these fantasies we live in, that we don't have to face the fact that we've got limited time, or we don't have to face the fact that we're always going to be emotionally vulnerable and things like that. So actually, taken into the activism context, in the climate case, that's a question of truly facing the reality about what the situation really is, not as a reason to not take action, but precisely like as the first step in any kind of meaningful action to sort of, that kind of acceptance is actually a sort of ground for change rather than a problem for it. But on top of that, I think there is, and there's sections in the book on this, I think it is also really important, especially in the sort of attention economy that we live in now, to see that actually, while giving our attention and energy to certain causes is a very important part of being a good citizen, increasingly knowing when to withdraw your attention from them is also important, right? If you just go out into the world of online communications and decide that you're going to try to do something about all the human suffering that you're presented with, that's something that no human could ever do, right? That no saint in history was ever asked to do prior to the digital communication revolution. And so I sort of make the argument in the book that being willing to pick your battles and say, like, well, this is my cause, or volunteering with this organization is my cause, or giving money if I can to this group is my cause. And I'm actually going to let go of the other ones, not because they don't matter, not because I've persuaded myself that I don't really need to care about them, but just because that kind of discipline is important in the modern world. And it's hard, right? Because on some level it involves reading articles about people suffering and not caring about it, in a sense. But I think it's critical that we understand that in the sort of attentional arms race that we're living, that's actually a much more effective way of making a difference, to be willing to concentrate your compassion and your energy in that way. And I think that sort of dissipation of compassion into sort of, well, I'm just going to sort of make the right noises about everything isn't the way forward.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that's kind of the primary cause of like overwhelm or burnout, that people are exposed to literally all of the injustices and problems in the world and, rightly want to help all of them? Is that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different, very different for different people. Some people set a large value on sort of the global and national and pro-social kind of side of things, and other people are overwhelmed by things much closer to home. But in all cases, all different versions of the mismatch between what you can do and what it feels like you ought to do. Just saying what I'm about to say is not the full solution, of course, but it is the case that it simply can't be the case that you must do more than you can do, right? That doesn't make logical sense. So the feeling that you must give more hours in the day than it's possible to give to something is something that ultimately you can let go of, because it's just not coherent. Yeah.
If we're all choosing our causes, is anyone going to choose climate when it's so big and it's so difficult to grapple with and it feels like you have so little control over it? And if someone was going to choose climate, how would you advise them to be a climate activist while still being fulfilled?
I mean, I think self-evidently a lot of people do choose that. So it is clear that there are, lots of people who are energized by that cause. I am not going to pretend that I'm sort of deeply, deeply involved, and therefore it's, I think it would be wrong of me to sort of give really specific advice about what to do. But I do think, and I, know enough people working in the space to have sort of formed this opinion that it's another of these cases. And I say this in the context of personal work and family and stuff in the book as well. But it's another of these cases where it feels like you shouldn't pay attention to questions like, what do you like? What do you enjoy? What feels fun? Because that feels like so monumentally superficial in the context of the crisis. And in fact, all experience, all evidence, and plenty of sort of psychological work testifies to the idea that that's not right. That ultimately it's extremely difficult to make a sort of both effective and sustained effort at anything if you're doing it sort of in the way that sort of fundamentally violates what it is that you want to be doing day after day, just because your fear or your anxiety or your very overarching moral dictums are sort of pressuring that out. So I would say, again, drawing on the work of people who know a lot more than me about it, that actually starting with any activity in that space that is actually fun for you is an important beginning, especially in the midst of a crisis that's so, dark and ominous and yeah, it feels unjustifiable. It feels self-indulgent. It feels inappropriate, and resisting all those inner voices is the challenge there.
A lot of the kind of things that you take aim at in your book are a culture of optimization, of pursuing efficiency. Is that a problem with reality, or is that just a problem with capitalism? And is your book politically an anti-capitalist book? Do you view it through that lens?
I don't, in the sort of ultimate sense. I think it isn't best understood in those terms, but I definitely do think that the problems that I'm isolating are massively exacerbated by the sort of stage of the economic system and culture that we live in. First of all, you get this whole shift from thinking about time in this kind of efficiency maximizing way at all before and then during the period of industrialization. And then you have the sort of extreme level of it that we're in now, where the sort of eking of every extra tiny bit of value out of even your own time feels like absolutely necessary just to stay afloat. Ultimately, I think the question is this just like it's not quite what you asked, but is this like a sort of timeless human thing, or is it specific to the economy? They sort of merge, because I think probably ultimately I'm quite persuaded by the argument that capitalism itself is sort of ultimately motivated by the fear of death, right? The idea that we're all just struggling to handle the fact that we're finite and that we're mortal, and the sort of resource extractive aspects of capitalist system are all part of kind of ultimately a sort of psychological agenda that says you're going to be able to keep on growing forever, that you're going to be able to sort of dominate nature in a way that frees you from the constraints of the human condition. So this is all pretty abstract, but I do actually think that they're sort of like, they're almost the same point. I think we are just sort of, since the beginning of time, human beings are grappling with their finitude, and the economic systems that we build are ultimately expressions of that. So I guess maybe it is anti-capitalist if you really follow the logic of that all the way through to the end.
Should children have lessons about death in school? I mean, if you feel that mortality and not understanding our mortality is like fundamental to so many of our psychological problems, would you have a sort of widespread change in society to acknowledge that more? And what would that look like?
I think this isn't a book, and my sort of thinking and things I write about are not really about sort of death and dying per se. I think finitude is obviously only exists for us. Limitation only exists because we do eventually die. So it's absolutely bound up. But I don't know, this is more from the research I did for my book, The Antidote, quite a while ago now. But those cultures which have a little bit more of a sense of that. I spent a very interesting night in a graveyard outside Mexico City with people celebrating the Day of the Dead years ago now. But those cultures where a sort of focus on the fact of death is a little bit less radioactive and less hidden away and less seen as sort of a violation of social norms to talk about, I think it does lead to a overall healthier to all these things and a sort of more empowering attitude. I also find, I mean, we've got a 7-year-old son. I also find that I'm always struck that actually quite often children are sort of thinking and talking about the lifespan and death, and they're not necessarily super freaked out by it. So I think some of that probably gets added in later, and maybe we just need to stand out of the way of some of those discussions and reflections.
I write a column for Prospect called Mindful Life that's kind of about mental health, and it's about my own mental health, so it's a bit of an oversharing column. But I really find your work interesting in kind of like the mental health space, because I actually first came across the antidote because it was given to me as a tool in a clinical setting for my treatment of OCD. My OCD therapist said, I want you to read this book and I want you to really think about the ideas within it. And one of the reasons for that was because I feel like we are going through a change in some kind of mental health treatments where the traditional model of cognitive behavioral therapy it's still very much being used, and it's still the gold standard in many settings. But for people like me who are tricky customers and who didn't respond so well to that kind of conventional treatment for OCD, a new wave of therapy is emerging, MBT therapy, mindfulness-based therapy. One of those leading ones being acceptance and commitment therapy, which kind of takes these premises that you're talking about in your book and builds a whole therapy model around them for clinical disorders that's about accepting the discomfort and suffering that comes with normal life, and also viewing your condition as part of you and as part of a bigger system rather than just an individual thing. I wondered what you thought about these ideas for people with mental health problems, whether you see your book as part of that world of trying to help people who are really, really struggling in that way, or whether you view your book as just something for everybody who's suffering and you wouldn't want it to kind of go into that kind of clinical practice.
I mean, I'm always amazed and happy when I hear that it's been useful in those contexts, because I have no qualifications in those contexts and can't possibly start giving advice to people about how to deal with specific diagnoses. And on some level, although I know that people with acute mental health struggles sometimes find this offensive, I do think that, there is some sense in which all of us are grappling with issues that are legitimately described as mental health related. So I guess I'm addressing those. I really like what I've seen of those kind of approaches, acceptance and commitment therapy, especially. And I think one of the things that they really have in common that then does crop up in a lot of stuff that I'm working on is this notion that the idea that there's something that needs to be fixed and then removed from your brain so that you don't have it anymore and you're the best person you can be can be very, very troublesome. And that there's something really beneficial, just at least asking the question about what would it mean for there to not be anything to fix here, not because you have to just deal with the problem and give up treating it. Well, there's a therapist called Bruce Tift, whose writing I really admire, who just at one point has this very simple thought exercise. He suggests, like, what would happen if you just think about whatever it is that you struggle with the most internally, psychologically, and think like, or even relationally for that matter, and think like, what would it be like if I knew right now that I was going to be afflicted by some version of this for the rest of my life, that I was always going to be at least somewhat anxious or compulsive or prone to procrastination or prone to depression. And he makes the point, which I think is really true, that for a lot of people, that's an immediately liberating thought. The idea that, okay, I'm not saying it has to be as bad as your lowest moments forever, but that you might not have to view the rest of your life as a sort of titanic struggle to eliminate some part of who you are, but could actually integrate it. And then, then you might as well get on with all the interesting stuff right now in the midst of all your problems. I think that's a really powerful lens.
But I'd love to ask you just one more question, sort of linking back to what we said at the beginning about, the realization that even if you can see all these things that you'd love to do in your own life, to change your own life, it's actually really hard to implement them. The three of us on this call, we're journalists and we're writers, and we're probably too chronically online. I think probably that's also true for you, Oliver, as it is for me and for Sarah. Do you feel that you implement the ideas in your book, or are you still in the process of trying to accept that you will never be able to implement all of them, and that's okay?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely both, right? It's like I've definitely changed. In some ways, the way I end up writing books, it seems, is that I get some sort of intellectual level insight into stuff. And then in order to actually write the book, I have to kind of change my personality to some extent in order to sort of authentically express it rather than just write about it as an idea. But it's sort of baked into this set of ideas, I think, that there's no closure. Spoiler alert, I do say at the end of the 4 weeks that, like, if you thought that 4 weeks was going to be all it took and then everything is done, then you haven't read a single word of what's gone before, right? But I also do think that change is real, that change can happen in 4 weeks or indeed in less time, and that sort of being willing to accept it as open-ended without thinking that means that it's pointless or that you aren't making progress is really important. So yeah, I'm definitely much less anxious and more sort of able to focus on the things that I want to focus on. And I think, though I guess it's not for me to say, that I'm sort of easier to live with and less of a jerk and all those things. But it would sort of baked into what I'm saying, that if I at any point am caught saying, I think I've finished and done, I'm now doing it all exactly right forever, I hope somebody would metaphorically punch me in the face.
Well, that's a lovely note to end on. We hope that there will be more metaphorical violence. We do not condone that. We're a prospect. But thank you so much for that really insightful discussion. I'm going to continue with the daily chapters. I'll let you know at the end of 4 weeks how I'm feeling about it. But yeah, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. I'd love to hear. Thanks. It's been great.